cold dawn light crept through the dusty window of Zachary Sutton's ranch house, and for the 500th time, he saw her ghost. It wasn't a real ghost, not the kind that rattles chains. It was worse. It was the memory of his wife, Eliza, standing right there by the stove, her amber eyes catching the morning sun. He blinked, and she was gone. Just an empty space where life used to be. 5 years. 5 years since he'd laid her in the cold ground beneath the cottonwood tree. And every single morning since, he'd made the same promise to that empty space. He would never marry again. That was one part of the promise. But there was another part, a darker part he spoke only at her grave. He would find out what really happened to her. Because the story the town told itself, the story of a swift and tragic fever, never sat right in his gut. Not for a second. The promise had been easy to keep. Solitude was his shield. He only rode into Silver Creek when the ranch demanded it, when the salt and flour ran low. The town had boomed since the silver mine opened, sprouting new buildings like weeds after a rain. More people, more noise, more reasons to stay away. He preferred the quiet hum of his ranch, the lowing of cattle, the wind whistling through the pines. Here, Eliza's memory was a quiet companion. In town, her absence was a gaping wound. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, the worn leather creaking in protest. Henry, the owner, was on the porch, rocking in his chair. "Morning, Mr. Sutton," Henry called out. "Been a while." Zach just nodded. "Need supplies." At 35, Zach looked a decade older. The Colorado sun and a grief that never slept had carved deep lines into his face. His hair, once black as a raven's wing, was shot through with silver. His eyes, though, they were the real tell. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen the bottom of the world and was still looking down. "Well," Henry said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "You picked an interesting day. Stage just brought in some new folks. Doc Evans's niece, for one. All the way from Boston. Parents passed. Zach didn't care about town gossip. He had a list in his pocket and a ghost in his heart. No time for strangers." He moved through the store with the grim efficiency of a man on a mission. Flour, coffee, bullets. The routine was a comfort, a small bit of order in a life blown apart. Then the bell above the door tinkled, and the world stopped turning. A woman stood there, her back to him, asking Henry's wife for directions. Slender, with chestnut hair pinned up under a simple bonnet. Nothing special, until she turned. Zach felt the floorboards drop out from under him. His heart seized, a painful, stuttering slam against his ribs. It was her eyes, Eliza's eyes. Not just the color, a shocking, impossible amber that glowed like honey in the dim light. It was the shape. The way they tilted up just slightly at the corners. The way they crinkled when she offered a polite, closed-mouth smile. It was a punch to the soul. He stumbled back, knocking a tin of beans to the floor with a loud clang. "Mr. Sutton, you all right?" Henry asked, his voice sharp with concern. The woman glanced over. Her expression was one of mild curiosity, but as her gaze met his, something flickered. A flash of... what? Recognition? It couldn't be. He grabbed his supplies, threw the coins on the counter without counting them, and fled the store. He didn't look back, but he could feel them. He could feel Eliza's eyes burning a hole in his back. It was impossible. Ghosts didn't walk in the daylight. Did they? For 3 days the ranch was his prison. He tried to work, to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of mending fences and tending to the herd. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. The woman in the store, with Eliza's face. He told himself it was a trick of the light, a cruel joke played by a grieving mind. But he knew better. He'd stared into Eliza's eyes every day for 10 years. He knew them better than his own reflection. On the fourth day, he couldn't take it anymore. He invented an excuse, needing nails, a lie so thin it was transparent, and rode back towards Silver Creek. He didn't ride to the general store. He rode towards the edge of town, to the neat white house with the small garden out front. Doc Evans's house. And there she was, kneeling in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, tending to a row of stubborn-looking vegetables. She looked up as his horse approached, shielding her eyes from the sun. A small, polite smile touched her lips. "Good morning," she called, her voice clear and steady. "You're Mr. Sutton, aren't you?" He felt nailed to his saddle. Up close, the resemblance was even more terrifying. It wasn't just the eyes. It was the line of her jaw, the way a stray piece of hair curled behind her ear. He managed to touch the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, I'm Bethany Edwards," she said, standing and wiping her dirt-stained hands on her apron. "Dr. Evans is my uncle." He just stared, his mind racing. Who was she? What was she? "My uncle says you have the finest cattle ranch in the territory," she continued, her amber eyes studying him with an unnerving intensity. It wasn't simple curiosity. It felt like she was searching for something, looking for a reaction, testing him. Zack felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. This was no coincidence. This woman, this Bethany Edwards, was here for a reason. And he had a terrible feeling it had everything to do with the promise he'd made on his wife's grave. He found his voice, rough from disuse. "Your uncle is a generous man." He should have turned his horse and left. He should have ridden back to the safety of his ranch and bolted the door. Instead, he found himself swinging down from the saddle, his boots hitting the dusty road with a thud. His body was moving, but his brain was screaming warnings. "He also says you're as stubborn as your prize bull," she said, a teasing note in her voice. The exact same phrase Eliza had used 100 times. A cold sweat broke out on his neck. Was he going mad? Was this some fever dream? "Been busy," he grunted, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He was aware of how he must look, unshaven, dusty, haunted. "Too busy for your own health," he says. "He'd be happy to ride out if that's easier." The offer hung in the air, an invitation he knew he should refuse. Getting close to her, to those eyes, felt like playing with fire. "I'll manage," he said, shifting his weight, desperate to leave but rooted to the spot. "You're settling in all right?" he asked, just to fill the silence. "It's very different from Boston," she admitted, her gaze sweeping over the rugged landscape. "But there's an honesty to this place. The land doesn't pretend to be anything it's not." The observation was too sharp, too insightful for a city woman just off the stagecoach. It was something Eliza might have said, something she had said on their first morning at the ranch. "Takes most folks a while to see that," he managed. She smiled again, a quick, knowing smile. "I've always been a quick study." A crack appeared in the wall he'd built around his heart, a tiny, terrifying fissure. He took a step back, retreating from the feeling. "I should get on," he said, grabbing his horse's reins. "Daylight's burning." He swung himself into the saddle, a clumsy, panicked movement. "Good day, Miss Edwards." He didn't wait for a reply. He spurred his horse and rode away, the sound of his own heart hammering in his ears, a frantic drumbeat of escape. But he knew, deep down, there was nowhere to run. The ghost had a name now, and she wasn't going anywhere. He threw himself into his work for 2 solid weeks. He rode the fence lines until his muscles screamed and his hands were raw. He drove the cattle to higher pastures, pushing himself and his horse to the point of exhaustion. He collapsed into his bed each night, praying for a dreamless sleep that never came. because every time he closed his eyes, Amber stared back. Then his prize bull, a beast worth more than the entire ranch house, came up lame. An infection, hot and swollen, had taken hold in its leg. It was a disaster, and it was a trap. He knew it, but he had no choice. He sent a boy into town with a message for the veterinarian, for Doc Evans. He braced himself for what was coming. The doctor arrived in his buggy late the next afternoon, and sitting beside him, a bag of medical supplies resting in her lap, was Bethany Edwards. Of course. Thought an extra pair of hands might be useful, Doc Evans said, his eyes not quite meeting Zach's. Miss Edwards has training as a nurse. The lie was so smooth it had to have been rehearsed. Zach just gave a stiff nod and led them to the barn, the sense of dread growing with every step. The bull was in a bad way, bellowing in pain. Bethany didn't flinch. She laid out instruments and medicines with a calm precision that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. She worked beside her uncle, her movements confident, her voice low and soothing as she spoke to the animal. It was like watching a phantom move through his life, wearing his dead wife's face. "Mr. Sutton," she said, her voice cutting through his daze. "Could you hold this cloth?" She held it out to him. As he took it, their fingers brushed. A shock, like a jolt of lightning, shot up his arm. He jerked his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Sorry," she said, her brow furrowed in what looked like genuine confusion. "No harm," he muttered, his voice tight. He forced himself to focus on the procedure, on the sick animal, on anything but the woman standing too close. A woman who looked so much like his wife, it felt like a violation. After the bull was treated and bandaged, courtesy demanded he invite them to the house for coffee. It was the last thing he wanted. His house was a fortress, the one place her ghost hadn't physically been. Until now. She stepped inside, and her gaze swept the sparse main room. He saw it through her eyes. The plain wooden furniture, the dust motes dancing in the light, the overwhelming sense of emptiness. Then her eyes locked on the small, hand-painted portrait of Eliza above the fireplace. It was the only decoration in the entire house. She walked towards it, her steps silent on the wooden floor. "Your wife?" she asked, her voice soft. "Was," he bit out, turning away to pour coffee into chipped mugs. "5 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss." There was no pity in her voice, just a quiet, sincere sympathy that was somehow worse. It disarmed him. Doc Evans cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "That was a bad winter. The fever took too many good folks." Zach just nodded, his back still to them. He remembered that winter, the blizzard that trapped them. The 3 days he'd held Eliza as the fever consumed her, her beautiful amber eyes clouded with delirium. He remembered his frantic, desperate ride for the doctor, and arriving too late. Always too late. "The bull should pull through," the doctor said, changing the subject. "Bethany's written down instructions for a poultice, needs applying twice a day." "I can manage," Zach said quickly. Too quickly. "Actually," Bethany interjected, her voice smooth as silk, "the application is quite precise. It might be best if I rode out tomorrow, just to show you." Before he could argue, before he could form the word "no," her uncle nodded. "Excellent idea. I have patients in town, but Bethany can handle this." It was a perfectly executed maneuver. They had him cornered. He could only nod, a prisoner in his own home, while a cold knot of anxiety tightened in his gut. She was coming back, and he knew this had nothing to do with a sick bull. She arrived the next morning, just as she'd said. She rode a gentle mare with a surprising confidence for a woman from Boston, her hair tied back in a practical braid. She wore a simple riding skirt, and she looked as if she belonged there, against the backdrop of his ranch, and the sight of it sent a fresh wave of unease through him. "Morning, Mr. Sutton," she called, her tone bright and cheerful. Too cheerful. "Brought the medicine." In the barn, she tended to the bull with that same unnerving efficiency. He watched her, trying to maintain a safe distance, trying to see her as a stranger. But it was impossible. Every gesture, every turn of her head was a painful echo of Eliza. "You're good with animals," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I've always found them more straightforward than people," she replied, not looking up from her work. "They don't hide what they're feeling behind polite words." The comment was a clear jab, and he knew it was aimed at him. "Not much for polite words myself," he grunted. She finally looked at him, and her eyes, Eliza's eyes, were glinting with amusement. "I've noticed. It's refreshing, actually. In Boston, everyone is always saying one thing and meaning another." She finished wrapping the bull's leg and wiped her hands on a clean rag. "My parents were like that, always worried about appearances, about what the neighbors would think." She was volunteering information now, trying to build a bridge he didn't want to cross. He found himself asking a question anyway, hating the weakness in himself. "What brought you west?" "I had nothing left for me in Boston," she said simply. "Uncle's letters." He painted the West as a place where a person is judged by what they do, not who their family is. "It can be," he acknowledged. "It can also be unforgiving." She took a step closer, and her gaze was sharp, probing. "Like you." The question hung in the air between them, a direct challenge. He felt a desperate need to retreat, to get away from her and her questions and those impossible eyes. "Fence line needs checking," he said, turning away abruptly. "Thank you for seeing to the bull." But she wasn't going to let him escape that easily. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "The treatment needs consistency." He didn't answer. He just walked out of the barn and into the harsh sunlight, feeling like a hunted man. For a week, she came every morning. And every morning, Zach told himself he would be cold, distant, silent. And every morning, she chipped away at his defenses. The conversation started small, about the ranch, the weather. Then she started asking questions about his cattle operation, and he found himself answering, explaining the complexities of a world he'd thought he would never share with anyone again. In return, she told him about her life, about being a nurse during the war, the horrors she'd seen, about her love of books, her quiet, solitary nature. She was building a picture of herself, piece by piece, and he was reluctantly taking it in. One morning, as they walked from the barn to the house for the coffee that had become an unwelcome ritual, she asked the question he'd been dreading. "Do you ever get lonely out here, Mr. Sutton?" "I'm used to it," he said, the answer automatic, the one he gave himself every day. But hearing it out loud, in front of her, it sounded like a lie. "There's a difference between being used to something," she said gently, "and it being good for you." Inside the house, she moved around his kitchen as if she belonged there, finding the coffee pot, the cups, without him saying a word. The simple domesticity of it was a knife in his chest, a painful reminder of everything he had lost. Or had it been taken? She sat across from him at the small table, her hands wrapped around her warm mug. "Your bull is healing nicely," she said. "I don't think my daily visits will be necessary for much longer." Relief. That's what he should have felt. A deep, profound relief. Instead, a hollow ache opened up inside him. The thought of the silence returning, the uninterrupted solitude, was suddenly unbearable. "Uncle thinks I should consider setting up as a midwife," she continued, watching him over the rim of her cup. "There's no one properly trained for 50 miles. The unspoken question was obvious. "You'd stay?" he asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. Her eyes met his, and for a long moment, the air crackled with unspoken things. "I might," she said slowly. "It depends if I can find a good enough reason to put down roots." He knew he was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the empty gray existence he had known for 5 years. The other led somewhere terrifying and unknown. He chose the safe path. He stood up abruptly, breaking the spell. "Town's growing," he said, his voice gruff. "They could probably use you." He turned his back on her, on the silent offer in her eyes, and walked to the window, staring out at nothing. He didn't see the flicker of disappointment on her face, but he felt it, like a change in the weather. The ghost was getting impatient, and he was running out of places to hide. 3 days later, the bull was healed. As Bethany packed her medical bag for the last time, a heavy silence filled the barn. Zach stood by the door, twisting his hat in his hands, a dozen things he couldn't say caught in his throat. "Thank you," he said, the words stiff and formal. "For the bull." "You're welcome, Mr. Sutton." Her formality matched his. She swung herself onto her mare with practiced grace, then looked down at him. For a second he thought she was going to say something more, something that would shatter the fragile peace between them. But she just nodded, a final polite dismissal, and rode away. He watched until she was just a small dot on the horizon. It was for the best, he told himself. The quiet would return. The memories would settle back into their familiar, hazy grief. He could go back to honoring his promise. He was wrong. The silence that descended on the ranch was different now. It was heavier, deeper. It wasn't the silence of solitude, it was the silence of absence. After a week of it, he couldn't stand it anymore. He rode to town, telling himself he needed grain, another flimsy excuse for a need he couldn't name. He saw her before she saw him. She was outside the dressmaker's shop, talking to the banker's wife, Mrs. Miller. Bethany was laughing, a real, unguarded laugh, and the sound of it hit him like a physical blow. A hot spike of jealousy shot through him, not jealousy over Mrs. Miller, but over the easy way Bethany was fitting into this town, building a life, while he remained a ghost on the outskirts of his own. She spotted him then, and her smile faltered for a moment before brightening again. "Mr. Sutton, what a surprise." He dismounted, feeling clumsy and out of place. Mrs. Miller gave him a curious look and then a knowing smile before excusing herself, leaving them alone on the boardwalk. "How is your bull?" Bethany asked, her voice polite, betraying none of the tension he felt. "Fine. Causing trouble," he muttered, acutely aware of the stares they were getting. The town recluse, talking to the pretty new schoolteacher. "And you? How are you settling in?" "Well enough," she said. "I've been assisting my uncle quite a bit." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "I've been invited to the harvest dance next Saturday. It's supposed to be quite the event." He knew about the dance. He and Eliza had gone every year. He hadn't set foot in the community hall since she died. "Town looks forward to it," was all he could manage. "Will you be attending?" The question was casual, but her gaze was not. It was a direct challenge. "Don't dance much anymore," he said, the excuse sounding weak even to his own ears. A shadow of disappointment crossed her face, but she hid it quickly. "Of course," she said, her voice cool again. "Well, good day, Mr. Sutton." She turned and walked into the dressmaker's shop without a backward glance. He stood there for a long moment, cursing himself. He had been given a choice, a chance, and he had let it slip through his fingers. He was a coward, hiding behind a promise he was beginning to realize was just another word for fear. The night of the harvest dance was cold and clear. 1,000,000 stars were scattered across the black velvet sky. Zach sat on his porch, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him, its seal unbroken. He could hear the faint sound of fiddle music drifting on the wind from town, and he could picture it all. The warm glow of the lanterns, the laughter, the swirl of colorful dresses. And he could picture her, Bethany, dancing with some young rancher or the blacksmith's son, smiling up at him, her amber eyes sparkling in the lantern light. The image was so clear, it was like a knife twisting in his gut. He slammed his hand on the table, the bottle rattling. This was madness. Hiding out here, drinking himself into a stupor while life went on without him. Before he could talk himself out of it, he was inside, splashing cold water on his face, pulling on his one clean shirt, the one he'd been married in. He brushed the dust from his good trousers and stared at the stranger in the mirror. The man looking back was hollowed out, but tonight, for the first time in 5 years, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. A desperate, reckless spark. The ride to town was a blur. The community hall was a beacon of light and life in the darkness. He tied his horse, his hands trembling slightly, and pushed open the doors. The music and the wall of noise hit him like a physical force. The room went quiet for a beat as heads turned. Zachary Sutton, the hermit, the ghost of Silver Creek, was here. Whispers followed him as he scanned the crowded room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. And then he saw her. She was standing by the punch bowl, wearing a simple dress the color of a summer sky. Her hair was piled on top of her head in soft curls, and a few stray wisps framed her face. She looked beautiful, and she was talking to James Peterson, the blacksmith's boy, who was grinning like a fool and leaning in way too close. A possessive, primal anger surged through Zach. He started across the room, his stride long and determined. People got out of his way. As he approached, she looked up, as if she could feel his presence. Her eyes widened in surprise, and then a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. A smile that was just for him. He reached her, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. James Peterson mumbled an excuse and vanished into the crowd. "Mr. Sutton," she said, her voice soft and warm. "I didn't expect to see you." "Changed my mind," he said, his voice rough. The fiddle music swelled, shifting into a slow, sad waltz. He didn't think. He just held out his hand. "Dance with me, Miss Edwards." Her smile widened. "I thought you didn't dance much anymore." "Making an exception," he said. She placed her hand in his, and it felt like coming home. He led her onto the floor, his hand resting on the small of her back. The steps came back to him easily, a muscle memory from a different life. They moved together in a silent, perfect rhythm, the rest of the crowded room fading away until it was just the two of them, swaying to the mournful music of the fiddle. "You dance well for a man who's out of practice," she murmured, her face close to his. "I had a good teacher," he said, the memory of Eliza waltzing with him in their tiny cabin rising up, sharp and clear. But for the first time, the memory didn't bring a wave of crushing grief. It was just a sweet, sad echo. "Your wife?" she asked gently. He nodded, surprised he could say her name without his voice breaking. "Eliza. She said a man ought to know how to dance properly." He hesitated, then forced himself to say the thing that had been haunting him from the beginning. "You remind me of her." Her step faltered for just a second. "Is that why you look at me like you're seeing a ghost?" The question was blunt, honest. She deserved the same. "Partly," he admitted. "Your eyes, they're exactly the same." Understanding dawned on her face. "I see." "It's not just that," he found himself saying, the words tumbling out now. "It's everything. Everything changing when I swore it wouldn't." "Change happens, Zachary," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. "Whether we want it to or not, the only choice we have is if we fight it, or find the courage to face it." The music ended. They stopped dancing but didn't move apart, standing in the middle of the floor, caught in the quiet space between the notes. The crowd swirled around them, but they were in their own world, a world where a decision had to be made. "Walk with me," he said, his voice low. "It's too loud in here." Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clean. They walked away from the lights of the hall, towards the dark edge of town where the prairie began. The stars seemed close enough to touch. He stopped and turned to face her, the moonlight silvering her hair. "I made a promise," he said, the confession feeling like a stone being lifted from his chest. "When Eliza died, I promised her I would never marry again, that I'd never let anyone else in." Her face was serious, her amber eyes searching his. "Do you think she would have wanted you to live out your life alone, a prisoner to her memory?" The question hit him with the force of a physical blow. Of course not. Eliza had been full of life, of laughter. The idea of him wasting away in his grief would have broken her heart. "No," he admitted, the word a ragged whisper. "She wouldn't have." "Keeping a memory alive doesn't mean you have to stop living," Bethany said, her voice impossibly gentle. "A heart is a big place, Zachary. There's room for remembrance, and for a new beginning." He looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw past the ghost of his wife. He saw Bethany, strong and kind and brave. A woman who had seen the darkness in him and hadn't run away. A woman who was offering him a light. "I'm not a man of many words," he began, "but—" He trailed off, his courage failing. She took a step closer, her hand finding his in the dark. "But," she prompted softly. "I'd like to call on you, Bethany," he finally managed. "Properly, if you'll let me." Her smile in the moonlight was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I'd like that very much, Zachary Sutton." As she said his full name, a new promise was sealed between them. Not one made to a ghost in the darkness, but to a living, breathing woman in the light. And for the first time in 5 long years, Zachary Sutton felt the faint, terrifying glimmer of hope. Their courtship was a quiet, cautious thing. He rode into town to see her twice a week. They would walk along the creek or sit on the porch of her uncle's house, talking for hours. He told her about his life with Eliza, about the ranch they had built together. And she listened, her quiet presence a balm on his old wounds. She, in turn, told him about Boston, about her dreams of being more than just a doctor's niece, of having a place that was truly her own. One afternoon she rode out to the ranch, uninvited. She brought a picnic basket with bread and cheese and a bottle of wine. They ate sitting on a blanket in the high meadow, overlooking the entire valley. "It's beautiful up here," she said, her eyes sweeping over his land. "This was Eliza's favorite spot," he said, the words coming easily now. "We used to come up here all the time." He expected her to go quiet, to become awkward the way other people did when he mentioned his wife. But Bethany just nodded. "Tell me about her," she said. And so he did. He told her how they met, how she'd followed him west, how she had made this rugged piece of land into a home. He talked for over an hour, and Bethany just listened, her gaze never leaving his face. When he finally fell silent, his throat thick with emotion, she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for sharing her with me," she said simply. In that moment, he realized he wasn't betraying Eliza by loving Bethany. He was honoring her. He was choosing life, just as Eliza would have wanted. But as winter closed in, a shadow began to creep into their fragile happiness. He started noticing things. Small things. A pensive look on Bethany's face when she thought he wasn't watching. The way she would sometimes fall silent in the middle of a sentence, a flicker of fear in her eyes. And the way her uncle, Doc Evans, watched them, his expression not one of approval, but of anxious calculation. Something was wrong. One night a blizzard descended, trapping Bethany at the ranch. They sat before the fire, the wind howling outside, a mirror of the storm that had taken Eliza. The mood was somber. Zack found himself staring into the flames, the old grief washing over him. "Zachary," Bethany said, her voice pulling him back. "There's something I have to tell you." He turned to look at her. The fear he'd seen flickering in her eyes was now a steady blaze. "When I first came here, it wasn't a coincidence." A cold knot formed in his stomach. "I know." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You don't. I came here looking for you, my uncle and I. We've been investigating Eliza's death." The floor seemed to drop out from under him. "Investigating? It was the fever." "Was it?" she asked, her voice low and intense. "My uncle was the doctor, Zachary. He signed the death certificate, and he has regretted it every day for 5 years. The symptoms, they were close to the fever, but not quite right. And there were others that winter. 2 other ranchers who died suddenly. Both of them had refused to sell their land to the silver mine. The room was suddenly ice cold. The silver mine, run by a ruthless man from back east named Silas Croft. A man who had tried to buy Zach's land, with its precious water rights, a month before Eliza died. A man she had personally told to get off their property. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I'm saying," Bethany said, her amber eyes locking onto his, "that my uncle suspects Eliza was poisoned. And until I got to know you, until I was sure, he thought the person who did it was you." The accusation hung in the air, a monstrous, unthinkable thing. He felt the blood drain from his face. She thought he had killed his own wife. All this time, her kindness, her gentleness. Was it all an act, a way to get close to a suspected murderer? The trust he had so carefully built with her shattered into a million pieces. He stood up, backing away from her as if she were the poison. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Zachary, please," she begged, tears welling in her eyes. "You have to understand. I don't believe that anymore. I know you loved her. I see it every time you look at me." "You see a ghost," he snarled, the old pain turning into a new, white-hot rage. "You came here with a lie. You looked at me with my wife's eyes, and you suspected me of her murder." "I came here to find my sister's killer," she cried, the words exploding from her. "My sister, Zachary." He stopped. The world tilted on its axis. "What? What did you say?" "Eliza was my twin sister," she said, the tears now streaming down her face. "We were separated at birth. I never knew her. I only found out about her after our parents died. I found letters. I came west to find the sister I never had, and I arrived just in time to hear she was dead. I had to know why. We had to know why. Twin sister." The impossible resemblance suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. She wasn't a ghost. She was a reflection, an echo of the woman he had lost. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a profound, soul-shaking shock. They had both been living with ghosts, but he wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a suspect. And the real killer was still out there. A man who wanted his land, a man who had been threatened by his wife. Silas Croft. "The mine," he said, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. "The water rights." Bethany nodded, wiping her eyes. "My uncle believes Croft has been poisoning the water sources of anyone who won't sell. A slow-acting poison that mimics the symptoms of a fever. He couldn't prove it. The sheriff is in Croft's pocket. Coming after you was the only way he could think of to stir things up, to make the real killer nervous." It was a reckless, desperate plan, a plan that had nearly destroyed them both. But it had worked. The killer was nervous. Because now, 2 people were asking questions, not just a grieving doctor, but Eliza's husband and her sister. The next morning, the blizzard had passed. A grim resolve had settled over the ranch house. They weren't adversaries anymore. They were allies, united by a single burning purpose: justice for Eliza. "We need proof," Zach said, pacing the floor while Bethany made coffee. "It's my word against Croft's, and he owns half the town." "Eliza kept a journal," Bethany said suddenly. "In the letters I found, our mother mentioned that Eliza wrote in a journal every single day. Did you ever find it?" Zach stopped pacing. He remembered it. A small, leather-bound book she kept in a loose floorboard under their bed. In the chaos of his grief after she died, he had completely forgotten about it. He went into the bedroom, his heart pounding. He knelt down and pried up the board. And there it was, covered in a thin layer of dust. He brought it out to the main room, his hands trembling as he opened it. Eliza's elegant handwriting filled the pages. He flipped towards the end, to the last weeks of her life. Her entries were filled with descriptions of the ranch, her love for him, her hopes for their future. And then he found it. An entry from a week before she died. "Mr. Croft from the mine was here again today. He is a persistent and unpleasant man. He offered a shocking amount of money for the land. When I refused, his eyes grew cold. He said we would regret it. He said this land had a way of getting rid of people who stood in the way of progress. But there was more." On the next page, she described a strange, metallic taste in the creek water. She wrote about finding dead fish downstream from the mine. She'd even collected a soil sample, wrapping it in oilcloth and hiding it, intending to send it to an assayer in Denver. She suspected they were poisoning the land. She knew. That's why he'd killed her. Not just for the water rights, but to silence her. "Where is it?" Bethany breathed, her eyes wide with horror and hope. "Where did she hide the sample?" Zach's mind raced, trying to remember every corner of the house, the barn. Where would she put something she wanted to keep safe, something she knew was dangerous? Then it hit him. The cottonwood tree. She had always called it their special place. He grabbed his coat. "Come on," he said, his voice grim. "I think I know." They rode to the high meadow, the snow crunching under their horses' hooves. The single cottonwood tree stood stark against the winter sky, its branches bare, and beneath it, the small, simple grave marker. Eliza Sutton, beloved wife. He knelt beside the grave, the cold seeping through his trousers. He started digging with his bare hands at the base of the tree, tearing at the frozen earth. Bethany knelt beside him, helping him clear away the snow and loose dirt. About a foot down, his fingers hit something hard, wrapped in decaying cloth. He pulled it out. It was the soil sample. The proof. They had him. They didn't go to the town sheriff. They rode straight to the federal marshal's office, 2 towns over. They laid out the journal, the soil sample, and Doc Evans's sworn testimony about the suspicious deaths. The marshal, a hard-faced man who couldn't be bought, listened to their story without interruption. When they were finished, he just nodded. "I've had my eye on Mr. Croft for some time," he said. "This is what I've been waiting for." Justice, when it came, was swift. The marshal and his deputies rode into Silver Creek the next day. They arrested Silas Croft in his opulent office at the mine. The news spread through the town like wildfire. The man they had seen as their benefactor was a cold-blooded killer. The investigation uncovered the full extent of his crimes. He had poisoned not just Eliza, but 3 other landowners. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. The silver mine was shut down, its operations deemed unsafe. The cloud of fear that had hung over the valley for years finally lifted. A week after the trial, Zach and Bethany stood in the high meadow beneath the cottonwood tree. Spring had come. Small green leaves dotted the branches, and wildflowers were beginning to push through the soil. "We did it, Eliza," Zach said, his voice quiet, his hand resting on the weathered headstone. "We got him." He turned to Bethany, who was standing beside him, her hand tucked in his. He looked into her amber eyes, his wife's eyes, his love's eyes, and saw not a ghost, but his future. The promise he had made in his grief had been fulfilled. Not the promise to remain alone, but the promise to find the truth. Now, a new promise was waiting to be made. "I'm not asking you to replace what I lost," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm asking you to help me build something new." He pulled a small, simple silver ring from his pocket, one he'd bought the day before. "Bethany Edwards, will you marry me?" Her smile was like the sunrise, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Yes, Zachary Sutton," she said, tears of joy shimmering in her eyes. "Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and a warm breeze rustled the new leaves on the cottonwood tree. It sounded, just for a moment, like a whisper of approval. A blessing from the ghost who was finally at peace. They had uncovered the darkness, and now they were free to step into the light, together. If you enjoyed this story of love, loss, and a dark secret that refused to stay buried, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the shadows. And let me know in the comments below, did you suspect the real killer before the final reveal?